All right, so we've been talking about various fisheries and methods of fishing, which are leading significantly to the unsustainable harvesting. Remember at one point we talked about that maximum sustainable yield, which is the maximum amount of a product you can remove from an ecosystem without compromising its ability to make that product in the future. So over 90% of the fish stocks at this point are being harvested unsustainably. And so obviously this is kind of a world level crisis that needs to be addressed. And we talked briefly about that international agreement component that's so essential to, having humanity creating kind of a united approach to dealing with this problem. So one of the problems that emerges culturally is, again, who owns the oceans and the streams? So we're seeing increased conflicts in international waters. Also, there have been a number of Supreme Court cases related to treaties and promises that were made to Native Americans, or in Canada called First Nation peoples. They were granted, unrestricted access to their traditional fishing grounds. So what you can see here are some Native Americans on the West Coast that are using traditional fishing methods to, harvest salmon from these waters. Obviously, it's extremely dangerous. This is still done today, and every few years, there are people who slide off these platforms and perish. But they are keeping true to their cultural inheritance and how their, tribe has harvested fish for many years. So as the fish numbers decline, should they have to take fewer fish? And so again, here's showing so this would be a traditional way of harvesting these fish. You can see it in the top left. These are more recent pictures. But then you get down onto the bottom pages, and more we're seeing Native Americans that have the right to do their traditional harvesting. These were granted to them in treaties, 100 plus years ago in most cases. But should they be able to take as many as they want using more modern fishing methods? And this has led to a great deal of controversy. So there was a famous case called the Judge Bolt decision, and this is where tribes in the western coast, they were offered, access to their traditional hunting grounds. And I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it was something along the lines of, as long as the sun rises and sets and water rushes out to the oceans. And so Judge Bolt was a famous judge that held states and federal government to that original treaty, and to this day they allow these people access to as many fish as they want, and that has driven a lot of non-Native American fishermen out of the business as the fishing stocks are decreasing. So it can get pretty nasty. Tempers can run pretty high. Okay, so now I want to move on to aquaculture. So obviously aquaculture is farming waterways. So there's a lot of benefits, most of which have to do with sustainability. This gives us an opportunity to manage things more than just, repeatedly harvest. Now we can monitor the stocks much more carefully. So one of the benefits is we can use these scraps called fish meal that can now be used as food to feed carnivorous fish. We also now know that there are a number of carnivorous fish species who are carnivorous in the wild. However, they don't necessarily have to be fed a carnivorous diet. They can actually be raised on a more vegan diet, and this can be controlled, of course, if they are in more regulated environments on fish farms, so to speak. Also, There are situations where you can have multiple crops that are being grown in a mutualistic relationship. So a really good example of this are raising fish in rice paddies. So the fish waste will fertilize the rice plants, and then the rice plants offer the fish food source by their roots, but also they will keep that water oxygenated for them. So here you can see these are carp and rice farms in Thailand. So it's very different than just, going out and harvesting from the open ocean. And then here's an oyster farm in the Pacific Northwest. This is where the vast majority of your oysters come from now. So these are underwater, of course, when the tides come in. This would be at low tide. Another example of fish being raised in tanks. And I believe this is going to show the vulnerability. So when the fish are confined, they do seem to be a little bit more sensitive. This can also reduce their resiliency. It can reduce genetic resiliency. So there are some problems associated with it. That leads us to the disadvantages. There's a lot of data that shows that pollutants can be much, much higher in farm-raised fish than in wild-caught fish. Obviously, this is going to depend on how they're raised. We know that organisms that are overcrowded have increased stress levels. Increased stress levels make their immune systems depressed, which can, make them susceptible to disease, infections. So many of these fish are raised with low levels of antibiotics just regularly mixed into their feed. We know that they are stressed reproductively. And it kind of removes the survival of the fittest element. They're being babied to a certain extent. And so there are many evolutionary biologists that think this is going to reduce the overall quality of the fish genetics. There are cases where now we are using genetically modified or genetically enhanced fish. And if these are being raised in tanks or netted areas, actually along bays in the actual ocean, or even, in the case of freshwater fishes, in tanks or inlets on creeks and rivers and so on and so forth, they can escape out into the wild. Now, what if we have those genetically modified fish, escape out to the ocean, they start to crossbreed. We have now artificially, manipulated what evolution took millions of years to create as the, best gene pool. So that is really kind of, a huge issue. Also, as we're seeing more and more of these fish farms cropping up, many of them, as I said, are right along the coastline in the bays or inlets, or even on, built above ground right along the shores, massive tanks. And this is kind of, really interfering with what the natural coastal habitat is supposed to be. So here are a couple of videos on opposing views. You should watch both of those. You can come back to them, or you can watch them now and then come back to the lecture. All right, now we want to talk about, again, that idea of who owns the ocean. So the UN Convention of the Laws of the Sea, UNCLOS, this was passed in 1982. And so this is an overarching, body of laws that we've tried to come together and agree to adhere to. They decided that the continental shelves belong to the country from which the continent, or country is arising. 200 nautical mile limit from the low water to the shore for a country that exclusively belongs to that country for economical use. So what this means is, if we look along the coastline of a particular country, they own that continental shelf. they cannot claim ownership beyond 200 miles out. Outside of that 200-mile limit, those are considered to be international waters, and that is not controlled by any one country. And in all honesty, this is where the conflict becomes in. We can't really tell China what to do with their coastal areas, but then again, who's to keep a country from going out into international waters and taking or harvesting more than is their share? So here are two other videos, lots of videos here, so I wanted to give you some time to try to watch those. Take some notes on the key points or the data. I may ask you to turn these video notes in for a grade.